She awoke in the morning not sure where she was. The room was very bright, and the air coming in from the open window by her bed was warm and sweet. Opening her eyes, she recognized the little room. She glanced at her alarm clock and was startled that it was already 10 o'clock. She sat up quickly, put on her light cotton peignoir, and went down the hall to bathe in the bathroom. Bill's bedroom door was closed tight, she noticed. Was he still asleep, or had he gone downstairs, she wondered. Once in the bathroom, she ran the hot water, then slipped into the long tub, thinking about the night before. I want to be with him all the time, she thought. How will this be possible? On her way back, she tapped softly on his door, then quietly opened it. He was still in bed, fast asleep, with his back turned to her. She walked to the side of his bed and bent down to kiss him on the side of his neck, near his ear. He turned on his back, smiling and flushed with sleep. "Top of the morning," she said to him, gently brushing his tousled hair off his forehead and sitting on the edge of his narrow bed. "Rise and shine." "What time is it?" he asked, yawning and stretching his arms out. "Around 10. What time did we get back last night?" "The clock said 3 when I last looked," she answered. He reached up and kissed her, and she rested her cheek against his. "Climb on in," he whispered, but she laughed and pulled away, conscious of the thin walls in the old house. "I'm going to get dressed now," she announced, standing up. "So you get up, you slug-a-bed, now." "Well, if I must," he said. She saw him watching her move away from him as he swung his feet down on the hooked rug beside the bed. Back in her room, she made her bed and put on a pair of light blue shorts and a crisp white t-shirt. Walking out into the hallway, she could hear Bill showering behind the closed bathroom door. The house was quiet, she thought. She walked downstairs and was surprised to see Betty reading in her accustomed chair in the living room below. "Well, good morning," Betty said, putting down her newspaper on the rug and pushing her eyeglasses up onto her head. Her tone was almost friendly, Susan thought. "Good morning to you, too," Susan said. She walked to a small, rush-seated chair and sat on the edge of it, facing Betty. "Did things work out all right with your car yesterday?" she asked. "Absolutely not," Betty replied, straightening in her chair. "I need a new transmission and a few parts that the shop has to order. At a time like this, I wish Lucretia were here with her Jeepster." "Can you rent a car till yours is ready?" Susan asked her. "Absolutely not," Betty said. "I simply won't spend the money. We'll just make do till it's ready." Susan looked down at the braided rug beneath her feet. Betty was quiet now, and Susan was wondering what she could be thinking. The advice that she had offered was obviously not appreciated. Did Betty think that she was extravagant by nature? She felt awkward now, unsure where to move in the conversation. "There's coffee in a bain-marie in the kitchen," Betty said suddenly. "Why don't you have a cup and help yourself to anything you might find in the fridge?" She pushed her glasses back on her nose and picked up her newspaper. Feeling dismissed, Susan stood up and said, "Thanks, I'll do that." She walked quickly to the bright and empty kitchen, closed the door, and began to set out the dishes on the table for herself and Bill. The glass coffee pot was ensconced in a container of slow-boiling water on the stove. So, this is a bain-marie, she thought. On the open shelves, she found a sugar bowl and a jar of marmalade. She noticed a few tiny ants in the area, but decided to leave them in peace. A few minutes later, she could hear Bill's and his mother's voices, and then his footsteps approaching. He walked quickly through the swinging door, smiled at her, and looked around at the table she'd prepared for themselves. "I'll get some bread from the pantry," he said, disappearing for a moment. He returned with a loaf of sliced brown bread and popped 2 pieces into the toaster. They breakfasted quietly, and to Susan's relief, were left alone. After they washed the dishes, they fixed a sandwich picnic for the beach. They then walked back into the living room. Betty's chair was empty, and Susan could hear the faraway tapping of a rapidly struck typewriter, somewhere out in the direction of the French wing. She assumed that it was Betty and wondered what she could be typing. Maybe accounts, she thought. Something to do with the running of this place, no doubt. She noticed Betty's abandoned newspaper and picked it up. The headlines were already familiar to her. "This Times is 3 days old," she remarked with surprise. "The papers are always a day or 2 late," Bill explained. "They come up by slow train from the city." They decided to go to the beach next and went upstairs to put on their bathing suits. Up in her room, looking in the small wall mirror, she noticed white strap marks on her reddened collarbone area from yesterday's sun exposure. "I must be careful," she thought, "and remember to put sun lotion on at the beach." She came closer to the mirror to check her face. Her nose looked a little sunburned too, she thought, and she had more freckles than she wanted. She wished that she'd remembered to bring a sun hat from home. She recalled seeing a large straw hat hanging on a hook in the back of her shallow closet. It was festooned with a geranium red ribbon that trailed down off it. It reminded her of something she'd seen before. Was it in Venice, she wondered? Yes, that was it. It was a gondolier's hat, she was sure. Could I borrow it, she asked herself. Deciding to ask Betty if it would be all right, she reached for it and carried it downstairs. She walked through the library in the direction of the typing sounds she'd heard earlier, but she realized as she was crossing the windowed passageway that the noises had stopped. "Betty?" she called, but she only heard an echo in the old French wing ahead of her. She looked around the immense drawing room hesitantly, then turned quickly and retraced her footsteps. "Bill?" she called from the foot of the stairs. "Be down in a sec," he shouted. She stood waiting, then sat on the little rush chair, the hat across her knees. She thought she heard a gentle rapping on the living room door. She got up and looked through the window. A white-haired gentleman was standing outside. She opened the door. "Good morning," she said. The man removed his cap and smiled at her. "Good morning," he said. "Is Mrs. Prescott in?" "I think she stepped out," Susan said. "I was looking for her just a minute ago." She was struck by his benevolent expression and polite air, and assumed that he was a friend of the family's. "My name is Bob Tilton, and I was up on the neighboring property," he said, "checking out the water pressure. I thought I'd drop by to see if Mrs. Prescott's newly installed well is performing properly." "I can't say," Susan said, "but I'd be glad to tell Mrs. Prescott that you stopped by." "I'd appreciate that," he said. "Please ask her to call me at her convenience." Bill came bounding down the stairs, towel in hand, saying, "What's up?" "It was Mr. Tilton," Susan said. "He dropped by to talk with your mother. He must be some sort of an engineer." "He's our plumber," Bill said. She had never met such a clean, well-spoken plumber in her life. She almost forgot about the hat. She extended it towards him. "This hat, I think it's your sister's? Do you think I could borrow it while I'm here? I got too much sun yesterday. I wanted to ask your mother, but she seems to have stepped out." "Sure," Bill answered. "I don't see why not." She put the hat on, pulling the thin rubber band under her chin. Passing a large framed watercolor, she saw her reflection moving over the glassy surface. A fleeting image of chic with the tilting angle of the hat. She ran upstairs to get her towel and lotion, then ran back to join Bill. who was waiting outside for her with the picnic basket. She stepped out onto the wide porch. Something yellow and to the side of her suddenly caught her eye. Just below the window of the passageway, she could see a small dead goldfinch lying on the porch, its neck broken, its eyes sunken, vacant. She approached it, crouched on her knees, and whispered, "Oh, Bill, a poor dead bird." "Why?" she asked, looking up at him. "Why here?" He stepped to her side. "Sometimes they forget to lower the blinds at night," he said. "In the morning, sometimes birds get confused because they can see through the windows and they think that there's just air to fly through. They sometimes hit their heads hard on the glass." How terrible, she thought. They stood there, looking at the bird. Then Bill went into the house, returning with a folded paper bag. He scooped up the bird carefully on the stiff paper. It lay there pathetically in the bright sunlight. "Where will we put it?" she asked. "I'll take care of it," he assured her, and he walked quickly to the edge of the lawn and tossed it far into a dense clump of bushes. She watched him walk towards the garbage pails near the back door and dispose of the bag. He called out to her that he would wash his hands and be back in a minute. She stood by the house mournfully now, and the blue, cloudless sky did not comfort her. She was glad when Bill emerged from the front door and walked beside her silently towards the beach path. Arriving at the top of the stairs, she looked down on the beach below. There were more than 24 people down there, she noticed. She could see Alex striding on the beach with a few men beside him, and Betty sitting on a towel with a cluster of people around her. "It's a great beach day," Bill commented, looking toward the sparkling water. He put his arm around her. "Let's make the most of it." They set off down the stairs, and she put her hand on the top of her hat to steady it in the wind. Would she have to meet all these people, she wondered, to talk to them? Well, I can't be rude, she reminded herself. Stepping on the sand, they walked towards the assembled people. Susan stopped suddenly. A man was standing on his head by the waterline. He was perfectly balanced, his legs perpendicular to the beach. Was it Alex, she wondered? He righted himself, and she saw that it was indeed Alec, in a state of high merriment with his admirers standing around and laughing. They walked towards Betty, and she saw that the people in her entourage were suddenly turning to look at her. She recognized a few faces from the party at the Coxes. Bill took her hand and approached Betty, who sat up from her semi-recumbent position and proceeded to introduce her to the group of middle-aged women around her. Susan leaned down to shake the well-tanned hands that reached out to her and made an effort to smile at each face that looked up at her. "Mr. Tilton dropped by and would like you to call him at your convenience," Susan said. "Oh, yes," Betty replied. "I'll do that." "Lucretia's hat," she asked. "Is it all right to have borrowed it?" "If you didn't bring a hat, you certainly should borrow one," she replied forcefully. Bill began to lead her away. "Oh, sit and talk with us, Bill," Betty begged. But Bill said they needed some exercise and wanted to take a long walk on the beach. "Maybe on the way back," Betty said, hopefully, looking up at him as she shaded her eyes from the sun. They passed Alec and his troop. He waved cheerily at them, and they kept walking till they found the little brook they'd sat by the day before. They decided to build a dam and went foraging for pieces of driftwood and small stones that had rolled down from the cliffs. Susan suddenly remembered her sun lotion and pulled it out of their beach bag. Bill rubbed some onto her back and shoulders while she knelt near the icy brook water. She leaned back against him, savoring the feeling of his hands on her. "Can I do the same for you?" she asked him. "No, I don't burn easily," he replied. He kissed the back of her neck, and they set to the task of redirecting the steady stream of spring water. They were intent on their project when she heard someone calling, "Bill! Bill!" She turned to see a beautiful young woman striding out of the surf just a little to the left of them. The woman advanced toward them rapidly, and Bill stood up to greet her. "Hello, Bree," he said. "Where have you come from?" "From the depths of the sea," she intoned dramatically. Susan was stunned by this apparition. The woman did look like some kind of sea goddess. She was almost as tall as Bill, and she wore a bikini that revealed her generous proportions. Her wet brown hair and eyelashes were curly, and small beads of salt water stood on her plump, tanned breasts. "Where's Lucretia?" she asked him in a breathless voice before he could get a word in edgewise. "Bree, this is Susan," he said, putting his arm around Susan. Bree glanced at Susan perfunctorily and said, "Hi." She then stepped back and said, "You're wearing Lucretia's hat." "Oh, yes," Susan admitted, feeling her face flush suddenly. "Do you think she'd mind?" Bree didn't answer, but began asking Bill where Lucretia was and when would she be back. "I'm hoping she'll come to my birthday party," she lamented, "but if she's not back by next Thursday, she'll miss it. I haven't seen her for a whole month, and I'm dying for her news." She swayed back and forth on her shapely legs, punctuating her words with extravagant gestures. Bill said he wasn't sure of her plans. "Wait! I see Betty up the beach," she burst out. "I'll ask her." She turned away, headed off with long, deliberate steps. Susan went back to the coursing brook and knelt beside it. The persistent current was starting to dislodge a fragment of heavy plank they'd planted in the deep sand. She placed a few rocks strategically to buttress it, but she was losing interest in the challenge. "What's the use?" she asked herself. She felt a little disheartened. She looked over her shoulder and saw Bill looking out towards the ocean. She got up and walked over to his side. "A determined lady," she commented. He snapped out of his thoughts, looked down at her and grinned. "Oh, Bree, yes, she's that all right. She practically grew up on this beach. She rooms with Lucretia at Radcliffe." She thought about Radcliffe. She never thought that she had the brains to go there. It seemed like such a rarefied atmosphere the weekend she had visited a friend there. A world for girls from the kind of background she didn't come from. The sun was beating down now, and she wanted to swim. She took off the hat, weighting its wide brim with 2 smooth rocks, and laid it on the dry, hot sand. They waded into the water, negotiated the strong surf, and found themselves out beyond the breakers. Bill had his feet on the ocean bottom because of his height, and she, over her head, swam over towards him and splashed water in his direction. "Two can play this game," he said, moving towards her. She turned, trying to escape, but soon he had her ankle, then pulled her to him. "I think I'll do some body surfing," he said soon after. And she watched him take steps forward, then deftly catch a wave that carried him smoothly up to the beach. She tried to do the same, but her timing was off, and the wave she chose abruptly tossed and flung her towards the shore on her back. She sat up, overcome with laughter, then went back for more. The second try was much better, and she stood up to see Bill on the beach, head cocked to the side, clapping his hands in approval. When they'd had their fill, they returned to the shore, dried themselves off, and sat down on the dry sand for lunch. Bill put on a long-sleeved cotton shirt, and Susan persuaded him to use some of her lotion on his nose and cheekbones. She looked down the beach and noticed that quite a few people were now gone, including Betty. "Gone up for lunch," she inferred. After lunch, she applied more lotion to her face and shoulders, put Lucretia's hat back on, and sat beside him, dragging her long beach towel over her knees. It's a scorching sun, she thought. An alarming thought occurred to her. What day is it today? She asked, at a momentary loss to remember. It's Monday. It's our third day on the island. Thank goodness it's only Monday, she said. It's my grandmother's birthday today, and I must call her later. She's 80. I'm worried about her. She's been feeling poorly lately, and the heat's really bad for her weak heart. Funny how I've lost track of the time, she went on. I feel like we've been here longer. It's the Isle of the Lotus Eaters, he said, chuckling. People come up here and lose their bearings. There's maybe something about being on an island that accounts for it. I know someone who missed a flight home because they lost track of the time. You have to pick up a swordfish later, don't you? She queried. I do, and we can drive to Menemsha around 5, he commented. It's a nice time of day with the sailboats coming in. You can call your grandmother when we get back. How's that? The idea appealed to her. What time do you usually eat? She asked. Oh, about 7, he said. Alec and Betty usually like a drink before dinner. The mention of the impending dinner made her anxious. The idea of being captive at the dinner table. What will we talk about? She pondered. She'd wished she'd read part of the old newspaper earlier in the day, or at least the editorial page, but realized it would be futile to grasp at such straws. It's beyond my control, she thought. There's nothing to do but muddle through somehow. She took comfort in thinking that, in spite of Betty's standoffishness, Alec seemed friendly enough, though she hadn't seen nor talked much with him really. And Bill, of course, would be there, and he was what counted. She was beginning to feel calmer now and almost groggy, the combined effects of the swim, hot sun, and the lunch. She spread out her towel and lay on her stomach, wiggling her toes into the sand beyond its hem. She rested her turned head on her folded arms and could see Bill spreading his towel beside her. He was looking at her out of his half-closed eyes. She smiled at him and stroked the hand that he reached out to her. Last night was lovely, wasn't it? She said, remembering the carriage house. It always is when we can be together. On their way back, they met Betty coming towards them on the path to the house. She was dressed in a tennis outfit and was swinging a racket as she walked along. I'm glad to have bumped into you both, she said briskly. Bill, you'll remember the swordfish for dinner tonight, won't you? Sure thing, Betty, he responded. It's been on our schedule. We'll drive down for it around 5. Betty turned to Susan. So you're enjoying yourself with us? She asked airily. Oh, yes, it's wonderful here, Susan replied, heartened by her interest in her. Did you talk much to Bree on the beach before? Betty asked him. She was thrilled to see you and wanted to know if you'd come to her birthday party a week from tomorrow. She didn't mention it to me when I saw her, Bill said. I think we should be back in the city by then. Oh, stay longer, Bill, Betty implored, reaching out to touch his arm. The heat in the city is almost ghastly now, and anyone who can is getting out of it. Susan thought of her grandmother and felt anxious at her words. We have to get back as we've scheduled, Betty, he said. Who are you playing today? Ellie Newmark, she responded. You remember her, don't you? The mosaicist? I got a notice of her show back in the spring, but I just couldn't get to it at the time. Betty looked at her watch. Well, I'm off now, she said, backing away and turning down a path that Susan hadn't noticed before. Your mother must have many friends here, Susan said as they walked on. She does, Bill said, but she keeps them at arm's length. She complains that even her good friends get too much for her at times. She's a private person and likes the remoteness of this place. She's never so happy as when she's by herself reading a good book. An unloved child, Susan wondered. "Would you like to play tennis tomorrow sometime?" Bill asked, changing the subject as they came in sight of the house. "That would be fun," she exclaimed, looking up at him. She knew he was a better player than her, but that didn't bother her. He never played for blood and had a way of usually placing his shots where she stood a chance of connecting with them. A little before 5, they climbed into his car and drove for the fish. They parked by the docks, and she thought she heard the temple bells as they got out of the car. "The bells, Bill? What are they?" she asked, turning in the direction that she thought the sound was coming from. Bill listened intently. They strolled where some sailboats were moored nearby. "I think you hear the pulleys slapping against the metal booms. It's the work of the wind," he said. "It's a lovely sound," she exclaimed. A steady stream of sailboats was coming back through the swiftly moving channel towards Menemsha Pond, and they watched the families and people moving back and forth on their decks, readying the boats for their night mooring. They sat and watched the activity for a while, then walked to the small fish store, where they picked up 2 swordfish steaks and a couple of lemons, should Betty have forgotten to buy some. They returned to the car and headed back. Arriving back, they saw Betty's car parked by the copper beach. Entering the kitchen, they found her preparing a salad on the kitchen table. There was a stack of unshucked corn beside the salad bowl. "You had success?" she asked. "Success," Bill responded. "I'll just throw the fish into the fridge." "So the car's fixed now," he went on, shoving the damp package into the refrigerator. "What exactly was the story with it?" "Transmission, all right," Betty said, "and leaking fuel pump. Ollie had no parts, but he called Falmouth, and they sent them over on the early morning ferry. The car was here when I got back from tennis." "A happy ending," Susan said. Betty looked down and continued slicing a cucumber. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the stove clock. "Seems to me we can dine by 7, she said. "But we'll have our drinks before in the French wing. I absolutely adore the late afternoon light there." "Would you put out the sherry and glasses, Bill? The tray's on the dining room sideboard, if you'll remember. Just carry it in when you're ready." "Sure," Bill said. "Can I be of help in any way?" Susan asked. Betty looked around quickly. "I think things are under control, Susan. I expect Alec any minute now. He generally gives me a hand." "Where is Alec, anyhow?" Bill asked her. "Canoeing, as usual," she replied. At her very words, there was the sound of a car stopping outside the back door. Susan could hear a car door slam and Alec's voice. Yes, it was splendid, wasn't it? Never a better day on the pond. Well, thanks for the lift." He came striding into the kitchen, fishing cap in hand, the portrait of a gentleman, thoroughly pleased with himself. Well, he boomed, looking from one to the other. "We have a veritable kitchen conclave here. Glad to see the car's been restored to us at last. What a nuisance that it had to break down." He turned to Susan. "And you, young lady, I trust you're having a good time up here with us." "Oh, yes," she replied. "It's a place of amazing beauty." "It is," he exclaimed. "And I'm always reminding the boys of how lucky they are to have lived in their same homes all of their lives. Do you realize that most Americans move every few years? And we've had good times here, Bill. Good times, haven't we?" "Yes, we have," Bill said. She thought his intonation flat, certainly not measuring up to the enthusiasm of Alec's. "Betty, may I use your telephone?" Susan asked. "I need to call home." "Of course," Betty said. "Take the phone in the back pantry. It's the closest." "Well, I'll set up drinks now," Bill said, turning towards the dining room. Susan walked to the little room in the back of the kitchen. It's a cunning room, she thought, with its glass-enclosed cabinets filled with cereal boxes, dried beans, and crackers. It had a musty, closed-in odor that was not at all unpleasant. Just by the phone, she saw the blue flowered jar that held Celia's cookies. She remembered Wally now, his coming by to say goodbye to them during their midnight snack only 2 nights ago. She missed him, his humor, his obvious appreciation about how much in love she and Bill were. Dialing her home number, she got a busy signal. I'll try a little later, she thought. She walked back into the kitchen. Betty was stooping over the stove, lighting a burner under a huge pot. Susan saw the corn on the table. "Are you sure I can't shuck the corn for you?" she asked. "Alec will do that," Betty said. "He likes to do it." Susan stood there for a moment, not sure what to say. She wanted to leave, but felt that it would be rude. The woman makes me tongue-tied, she thought. "Well, I guess I'll go see what Bill's up to," she said lamely. She walked into the dining room to find Alec coming out of his side bedroom. He had changed into a fresh cotton shirt, his hair was carefully combed over his bald spot, and he gave off a strong scent of shaving lotion. Old Spice, she thought. She smiled at him in passing, but he seemed not to notice as he headed rapidly for the kitchen. She continued on out to the French living room where Bill was setting out glasses and a sherry decanter on a low table before the love seats. The room is very elegant, she thought, with the slanted rectangles of tawny light on the old polished floors. It had lost the spooky look that she remembered. She noticed an old upright in the corner of the room and wondered whether anyone ever played it. "I tried to call home, but the line was busy." "You could try now. Take the phone in Betty's room. It makes no sense to go all the way back to the pantry." She looked beyond him and saw that the doorway to his mother's room was half open. "I'll try in a minute." "Bill? Bill?" She could hear Betty's voice calling from the direction of the older wing. "I'll be right back," he said. "I wonder what she wants now." She watched him stride back through the passageway. It was very quiet in the big room, and she sat still, thinking of her grandmother. She stood up and walked through the doorway into Betty's bedroom. To her right, she saw Betty's massive desk pushed against the wall. Beyond it was a tall, beautifully carved window with a view of an old stone wall. She walked to the desk and saw the phone placed beside a stack of neatly arranged papers. She pushed back the heavy desk chair, sat on the edge of it, and slid the phone closer for easier access. She dialed and was pleased when her mother picked up after a few rings. "How are you, dear?" her mother was asking. "Are you having a good time up there?" "Oh, yes, Mom. It's fantastic here. Bill's taken me around the island and we've been swimming a lot on a wonderful beach. I wish you could see this place. It defies description." "That's lovely, dear." "And how is Nanya?" "Not too well, dear. She's got the pain on her left side that runs down into her arm. The doctor's given her something, but she's still quite uncomfortable. She doesn't complain, but you can tell that she's suffering." "Is it terribly hot there now?" "It is, dear, it is. I think it makes her feel worse." "Can I talk to her? Can she come to the phone?" "Of course she can. Just wait a little, and I'll get her." She looked around Betty's room now, the wide bed between 2 night tables, the heavy mahogany highboy, the deep fireplace with its brass tongs, bellows, and screen. A handsome copper weather vane, in the shape of a running horse, caught her eye as it rested on the mantelpiece. "Susan, dear, is it really you?" she heard her grandmother's wavering voice say. "Happy birthday, dear Nanya," she sang into the mouthpiece. "Happy birthday to you." "Oh, well, you are sweet to call an old woman like me. How are you feeling?" "Not too bad." "And the heat's not too terrible for you?" I stay quiet, dear. There's the fan, and your mother brings me cool drinks from time to time." "That's good, Nanya, that's good. And when will you be home, dear?" "In just a few days," she said. 5 days, to be exact." "That's not long, to be sure. And so, have a good time, and I'll see you soon. Would you like to talk to your mother again?" "For a moment, Nanya." She could hear her grandmother calling her mother. Her eyes drifted onto a thick ledger near the phone. Betty's accounts, she deduced. She also noticed the typewriter on a far corner of the desk. "Hello, Susan," her mother said. "It's wonderful that you called. You've definitely lifted her spirits." "Good, Mom. You have this phone number, don't you? I mean, if anything went wrong, you'd call me, wouldn't you?" "Of course, Susan. Don't worry. You have a good time there. Bill's fine, I hope." "Oh, yes, he's been good to me. Bye now. I'll call before I leave." She put the receiver back on the phone and raised her eyes upward in thought. Something on the wall caught Susan's attention. Some nondescript object that suddenly jumped out at her as she focused on it. It was pinned on Betty's bulletin board along with notices and odds and ends. It was the photo that Wally had taken of Bill and herself, the eve of his departure. But it was only half of the photo now. She could see Bill's smiling face, caught in that moment when their heads were close together. The other half, the picture of her, had been carefully cropped off. Was it the long pair of ornate scissors upended in the leather container that had done this? The scissors as long and slender as Betty's hands. Was it Betty? Really? Who had done this? Severed them from each other, thrown her smiling face into the wastepaper basket beside the desk. She didn't want to look down to the side. The basket was there, she sensed, but she couldn't face looking into it. She shut her eyes, pressing her palms into the sides of her temple, resting against the edge of the desk. "I can't believe this," she thought. "I simply can't believe it." How could Betty do this, she wondered. What had she done or said to merit such treatment? Bill had once told her that Betty thought that a woman should have the 3 B's: beauty, brains, and breeding. Was that it? Was that what she didn't have? But that was foolishness, along with Betty's telling him that he should have great thoughts, important thoughts, even while shaving in the morning. She began to think of her grandmother, to hear her grandmother's sweet voice in her ears, her Irish brogue, the love that had come over the telephone to her, and she began to cry. Her tears ran down her cheeks, and she tried to push them away with her hands and wipe them on her cotton skirt. She saw a box of tissues on the desk and whipped out one angrily, wiping her nose. Her hands were trembling, and she tried to keep them still. She wondered what she could do, knowing what she knew now, knowing how she was regarded in this house. Persona non grata, she thought. I should have never come, she thought. I should have realized after that dinner in New York that Betty didn't like me, that she could see that I don't belong in this kind of world. She's cruel and forbidding, she thought, and she remembered her grandmother again and wishing she were home with her. She would understand. She would be angry that she had been hurt this way. Tears leaked down her face again. She heard Bill's steps coming across the living room. She tried to muffle her sobs. He poked his head through the door, and seeing her, his face registered alarm. "What's the matter, Susan?" he asked, kneeling beside her in a flash. "What's wrong?" "It's my grandmother," she said brokenly. In a way, it was true. It was her grandmother's love that was mixed with the hurt that had been done to her. "Is she sick?" he asked her. "What happened to her?" "Bill, Bill," she could hear Betty calling. "Our drinks are ready now." The woman sounded nearby, Susan thought. I don't want to be anywhere near her, now or ever. Bill stood up and stepped into the other room. "Betty, Susan's had some bad news. She's quite upset now. Why don't you and Alec take your drinks to the other wing? We'll be over when she's feeling better." "What's happened?" she heard Betty saying. "I'm not sure yet, Betty. We'll join you as soon as we can." His voice was tense, exasperated. "Oh, all right," she heard Betty saying, and the sounds of her walking away. She began crying softly again. "Tell me what's wrong," he said. "Tell me what's upsetting you so much." "It's my grandmother," she said. She was overcome with crying again. He held her, rubbing her back with his hand. He reached over to get her some tissues, waiting for whatever she would be willing to tell him. "Can we go outside?" she asked. She didn't want him to discover the photo above them. "Can we be by ourselves for just a little while?" "Of course." He guided her towards a door beyond the bedroom and led her outside to the back lawn bordered by the old stone wall. There was an iron love cast by the porch steps, and he pulled her gently towards it. They sat together, and he took her hand. "Tell me about it. What's going on?" "My grandmother's ill. She's in pain. I'm very worried about her. If she has another stroke, it may be the end." "Do you want to go home now?" he asked, bending towards her. "Would you feel a lot better if you went home? We could leave tomorrow. We could get the 6 o'clock ferry. We'd go on standby, get down there by 5. Our chances would be pretty good to get off the island that early." "Bill, could we? Could we really do that? I hate to spoil your time up here, but I need to get home to check things out." "But you're not spoiling my time up here. I only came up here because you wanted to come too. I had no intention of making the trip if you hadn't been able to." She leaned against his chest and closed her eyes, soothed by his body heat and the feel of his hand rubbing her back. Somewhere high above them a flock of Canada geese was winging, their cries proclaiming their passage across the evening sky. "Can I get you some sherry?" he asked after a while. "That would be nice," she said. He got up and went back into the house. She closed her eyes, enjoying the slight breeze that was moving over her warm, swollen face. I must look a sight, she thought. But she felt at peace. In a while, Bill came back with 2 glasses of sherry. She took a sip of the amber liquid, savoring the velvety flavor. "It's so smooth," she said, feeling its warmth plummeting through her. "Harvey's Bristol cream," he said. "The good stuff," she said. "What you'd expect around here." He laughed and kissed her cheek. They sat a while longer, then went back into the house. They crossed quickly through the French wing. The older part of the house smelled of broiled fish, and she could hear Alec and Betty talking in the dining room. "You go on in," she whispered. "I need to run upstairs and rinse my face off. I'll be right down." "You're sure you're okay?" he asked. "I'm fine now." In the upstairs bathroom, she bent over the sink and flushed her face with cold water. Refreshed, she blotted her face with her towel, then looked at herself in the mirror. "I'm fine now," she thought. "I know what I'm dealing with now, and I'm not going to let this woman make me cry again." She walked downstairs and into the dining room. Alec rose at her entrance. "I'm terribly sorry for the troubling news," he said. "Your grandmother must mean a—" Betty cut in with, "How perfectly awful! We had no idea that anyone in your family was ill." Bill tells us that she's had heart trouble. Is she under a proper doctor's care?" "Yes, thank you," Susan replied, looking directly at Betty. "We've been concerned about her recently, and especially in this hot weather." "She should come to a place like this," Betty said. "Hot weather is terrible for older people." She heaved a sigh, then rose in her chair. "Will you two have something to eat now? We've kept your dinner warm on the stove." "Sit down, Betty," Bill said loudly. "I'll get something for us both. I know my way around out there." Betty sat down and slid the wine bottle towards Susan. "Will you have some?" she asked. "Please," Alex said, rising from his chair. "Let me pour you a glass." "Thank you. You're very kind," Susan said. Bill returned with 2 plates of fish, corn, and wilted salad. "Bill informs us that you need to go home tomorrow," Betty said. "Such a shame that you must go under these circumstances." "Yes, the circumstances are unfortunate," Susan replied, looking down at her plate. She took a sip of wine. "There's so much we can't control in this life," Betty said, heaving another sigh. "We have only our inner resources. We must have faith, as much as a grain of mustard seed." Her voice trailed off. "True," Susan said. She took a deep breath. "Tell me about Maureen," she said directly to Betty. "How did you know her? I understand that she visited you here a long time ago." Betty paused for a moment. "Well, yes, I knew her well, but that was ages ago. We worked on various causes, the League of Women Voters, labor organizations. She had spirit. I admired her. How is it you lost touch?" "Hard to say. She moved out to Pennsylvania, then further out west. Actually, I knew her best in the years that I was married to Bill's father. She and her husband were quite friendly with us then. She came up by herself in August of '33, I think." "Where did she stay?" Susan asked. "In the guest house down in the woods." Susan thought of the guest house, the long room upstairs, with Bill's arms around her. "What about some dessert?" Betty asked, breaking into Susan's train of thought. "Celia's made a superb Indian pudding. I'll start the coffee." "I couldn't, thanks," Susan said. "What about you, Bill?" "No thanks," Bill said. "I'm off caffeine for the evening. We have to be up by 4. "Why such an early ferry?" Betty exclaimed. "Such a shame, all of this. Bill, would you consider coming back for the long Labor Day weekend? We'd foot the bill." "Nice idea, Betty, but we'll be too busy at that time. Classes begin the day after." Alec laughed. "You know, my dear," he said, "that not everyone can just drop everything and come up to a beautiful place like this the way we do." Betty began stacking plates and stood up. Seeing her rise, Bill stood up. "I'll give you a hand with things," he said. "We'll polish things off in a jiffy." Susan began to get up, but Bill said, "Stay still, Susan. Sit with Alec and relax." "Yes, do," Alec said. "We'll have a nice chat here." She watched the two clear the table, then turned to look at Alec. "Bill tells me you live in New Jersey," he said agreeably. "Yes, in Alpine. Do you know where that is?" "I do. I was almost arrested for trespassing there years ago while I was hiking with some friends." He seemed very tickled at the idea. Seeing her look of surprise, he continued, "Well, we shouldn't have been there. Our group of birders lost our direction in the woods, and before you knew it, we were being stopped by an irate caretaker. I talked our way out of it, but it wasn't easy." She thought of her godfather and the surveilled woodland properties that he owned in the town and decided not to pursue the subject any further. "Alpine's lovely," she said. "I love the views of the river." "I've loved rivers and woods all of my life. I once had a camp on the Hackensack River. And after Betty and I married, we bought a place near there with mountains and a river right on our doorstep. We go out there weekends, and I canoe to my heart's content. Being there renews me, gets me out of the noise of the city. Susan thought of the city, its excitement and endless possibilities. She loved the outdoors, but woods and isolation were too lonely for her. She thought she'd like to live in the city one day, perhaps in a tall building with an elevator. "I'll let you in on a little secret," Alex said, inclining towards her. "I prefer rivers to the seashore." He smiled at her significantly. This man has a way with women, she thought. "But you manage to canoe around here quite a lot," she said. "A pond, even if it's a large one, isn't a river. And it's a nuisance to rely on people to get me there. Betty won't hear of me driving." "I met your very nice plumber today," she said. "Bob Tilton, our plumber with the Harvard degree." Seeing her amazement, he continued, "Yes, Bob went off island for his Harvard education and came back to continue the family business." "That's amazing," she said. "He seemed so educated that I took him to be your friend." The phone rang somewhere and Bill emerged from the kitchen. "It's Wally, Alec, calling from New Haven. Why don't you pick up on the other phone?" Alec rose and trotted off towards the French wing. "Come join me in the kitchen," Bill said. "We're pretty much finished in there." He bent over the table and blew out what was left of the candles. In the kitchen, she could hear Betty's excited laughter from behind the closed pantry door. She noticed a butter dish left on the counter and put it in the fridge. Bill was wiping down the area around the dish rack, humming to himself. He gave the cloth a decisive squeeze, then draped it over the faucet. He spun towards her, smiling. "So, we're off at the crack of dawn tomorrow?" "Yes, it makes me feel better knowing I'm going home." Betty came into the kitchen. "Wally sends his best," she said. "Actually, to the both of you." "Good man, that Wally," Bill said. "Glad we overlapped." Susan looked out of the window. It was already dark. "I'll run upstairs and organize for tomorrow," she said. "I'd love to take a nice warm bath." "Wait an hour for the bath," Betty said, heading out of the kitchen. "The hot water's low after dishwashing. It will take time to replenish it." "Okay," Susan said, but Betty was already out of earshot. They left the kitchen and Susan heard loud music streaming from the French wing. It was a waltz, and it was being played with gusto and lots of pedal. "It's Alec and his schmaltzy tunes," Bill said. "Want to go in and listen for a minute?" "Sure." They crossed into the other wing and found Betty, semi-recumbent, on a love seat. Alec was attacking the keys of the old upright with great aplomb. The music was melodramatic, turgid, and almost made the sober room into a madcap carnival setting. "Sit with me," Betty called out. "Alec needs an audience." They sat opposite her, listening to him finish the waltz, launch into Lily Marlene, and then follow with a briskly paced Waltzing Matilda. "I love it, Alec," Betty called out, laughing at his musical excesses. "I do so enjoy hearing you play." He finished the medley with a flourish, swiveled around on the piano seat, and bowed to their clapping. Closing the piano, he headed for the other wing. Susan got up from her seat. "Best I go upstairs now," she said. "I need to pack my things." "But that will only take a few minutes," Betty protested. "Susan's exhausted," Bill said. "You can see it in her eyes." Betty stood up reluctantly and followed them out of the room. "A terrible turn of events," she said when they reached the foot of the stairs. "Who would believe that you'd come all this way and then leave so soon?" "There'll be other times, Betty," Alec chimed in, speaking from his corner reading chair. "But you never came up last year," she said to Bill, looking at him reproachfully. "Betty, I can't come up every summer of my life," Bill exclaimed. "But you were raised here," she said in a puzzled voice. "Why should we have a place like this if you won't use it? I mean to leave it all to my children someday, to you, Jay, and Lucretia. I want you to love it the way I do." "Betty, let's not get into all of this right now," Bill said. "I'll come when I can, and Lucretia certainly loves the place as much as you do." She does, Betty intoned, her face brightening. "She called, you know, when you were out buying fish. She'll be back by the end of the week. She's had a marvelous time with the Madrigal group, but has had enough. She's actually dying to get back here." "You and Lucretia are just alike," Alex said, chuckling. "You're never happier than when you're on this place." "Never a truer word spoken," she breathed. "Well, I must go upstairs," Susan said. "Thank you both for the very good time here. I'm sorry to turn in, but I'm really quite tired." "Sleep is the best restorative," Betty said. "I'll be leaving fresh linen in the upstairs hall so you can both change your beds when you rise. Just put your old linen in the bathroom hamper." Walking back from her warm bath a half-hour later, Susan tapped on Bill's door. "Come in," he said softly. "How was the bath?" "It was fine. How's the packing?" "I'm pretty much through," he said. "I didn't bring that much." He seemed a little down to her. "Do you feel bad about leaving tomorrow?" she asked him. "I'm sorry to cut the trip short like this." "No," Bill said emphatically. "Funny thing, I thought we'd have a better time. It's been a strain sometimes. I don't think we've had enough time by ourselves." "I know," she said, sitting beside him on the bed, grateful that he felt this way. "When we get back to New York, I'm going to try to find a place of my own," she said. "I don't want to live at home come September. There's a woman's dorm on campus, and I could maybe get a room there. It would be nice to be on my own." He put his arms around her, and she closed her eyes. "Come stay with me," he said. "I'd really like that." "Me too," she said, "but I can't really. My mother wouldn't stand for it. Fallen woman and all that, you know," she laughed softly. There was a tap on the door. "It's Betty, Bill. I've left the sheets." "Thanks," he called out. "We'll take care of it." She listened to Betty's parting footsteps, relieved that she hadn't come into the room. "Well, I guess I'll turn in myself," she said. "It'll be a long day tomorrow. Shall we set our clocks for 4:30? "Sounds right to me," Bill said. "We'll have a good time on the trip down. Coffee on the boat and a view of the sunrise." He kissed her, and she went out into the hallway. She could see that the lights were off downstairs, so she quietly went down the stairs, heading for Lucretia's ribboned hat. The little terrier growled softly as she tiptoed to the woodbox where she'd left it, but she whispered, "Shh, surprise. It's only me." Hat in hand, she mounted the stairs quickly and walked to the closet where she replaced it. "It's only a straw hat," she thought, "but it's been a burden to me." She turned out her light and slipped into bed. The luminous dials of the alarm clock read 11:30. "I'm not tired enough to sleep," she thought. "Well, I'll rest anyhow and try not to think of Betty." She thought of being back in the city again with school and Bill nearby, about the women's dorm. "I'll call when I get back," she resolved. She finally fell into a light, troubled sleep and dreamed that she was stranded on the beach, trying to get back to the house, back to Bill, but the sandy cliffs kept eroding and she couldn't scale them. Then, after a terrific effort, having found some vines to hold on to, she was back on the path to the house, but Betty, suddenly turned up from a side path, waving her pruning shears. She woke up frightened, looked at the clock, and saw it was only 3:30. Lying quietly for a few minutes, she decided to get up, strip her bed, and put on the fresh sheets that Betty had left in the hall. The bed made, she folded her old sheets and took them to the bathroom hamper. It was quiet and dark under Bill's door. At least he's sleeping, she thought. It will be a long drive back today. Back in the room, she dressed quickly, then sat on her bed, careful not to spoil the way she'd placed the bedspread. If only I had something to read, she thought. She walked over to Lucretia's bookshelves and pulled out a poetry book, but was too restless to concentrate, so sat watching the hand of her clock advance. Minutes later, she heard Bill's tinny alarm go off. She stuck her head out of the door when she heard him come out to the hall. "You're up already?" he asked, amazed. "I was going to let you sleep a few more minutes." "I've been up for a while." "I'll meet you downstairs in 10 minutes. She picked up her suitcase and racket, turned out her light, and slowly went downstairs. Surprise gave out a low growl. "Shh," she said, afraid that Betty might hear him, but the little dog quieted down and returned to his bed. She sat in the dark, waiting. Bill came down shortly and they carried their things out, careful not to bang the door behind them. The sky was inky black and the air was chilly and damp. They threw their suitcases in the back of the car, and Bill took a rag to the sopping wet window shield of the Chevy as she sat in the passenger seat. She shivered and reached into the back for her thick sweatshirt. Bill climbed into the car and started the ignition. She could see the dark house in the headlights as they swung around the old copper beach. Then they were out of sight of it, driving down through the woods on the winding road. At the last bend, a mother pheasant and tiny brood were crossing the road. Bill hit the brakes, and the little convoy scrambled safely into the bushes. "That was close," he said. "No need to rush, really. We have plenty of time." They arrived at the ferry slip to find only one car ahead of them, on the standby line. It was a VW van piled with people, suitcases, and sleeping bags. Bill ran to buy a ticket, and she rolled down her window. The town seemed fast asleep, and the only sound she heard was the quiet ripple of water lapping against the pier. In the rearview mirror, she saw a milk truck speeding past on the main road. The sky seemed to be not as dark as before. Bill came back. "We've got a good chance of getting on the 6 o'clock, he said. "If it doesn't work out, we'll take the 8:30. She leaned back and closed her eyes, glad at the news, and was startled to find Bill gently shaking her awake. "What happened?" she said groggily. "Did I go back to sleep?" The sun was up and she could see that the ferry lines were packed with cars. "You needed it," Bill said. "I may have dozed off for a while, too." I just want to say the sentence, "Did I go back to sleep again?" This is page 88. The top of this last paragraph on page 88. Okay? They watched the ferry approach, then dock, and the long line of delivery trucks coming off it. They waited in suspense as the reserved cars boarded, and to their relief were given the high sign that there was, after all, space for them. Bill started up the car, and they were carefully guided to one of the last slots in the boat. "Let's go for coffee," Bill said. They climbed up the staircase to the upper deck. The saloon was filled with leather benches, and there was already a line of people waiting by the coffee counter. "Why don't you walk out on the deck?" Bill said. "No point us both waiting here. Check out the sun." Looks like it's a nice day. She walked towards the heavy door leading to the deck and saw a young woman pushing a stroller with a sleeping child beside it. "Can I give you a hand?" she asked. The young woman smiled. She was pregnant, her belly low and large. "Thanks," she said, smiling. Her face looked tired. Susan pushed open the heavy door so that the woman could tilt the stroller over the raised step, and she followed her out onto the deck. The windows of the quiet town were blazing, reflecting the light of the rising sun, and the air was fresh and bracing. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said to the woman. "Oh, yes," the woman said, slowly pushing the stroller towards the railing. "When's your baby due?" "In 3 weeks. It's been a godsend for us to get away from the awful heat." "Do you come often?" "It's our first trip." "Mine too. Are you here with anyone?" "My husband. He's getting us coffee." "I'm waiting for my coffee too." She felt Bill beside her and looked up at him as he handed her a styrofoam cup of coffee. She took a sip. It was weak, but it was hot, and it seemed to clear her head a little. He put his arm around her shoulder. "Shall we walk around?" he asked. "Sure." She looked at the young woman. "Bye now. Hope things go well," Susan said. "Thanks. Have a good trip home." Bill took her hand and they walked across the deck and leaned on the rail. The boat horn gave several ear-piercing blasts, and they could see the water churning white foam below them. She could feel themselves moving very slowly. "We're off," Bill said, hugging her. She watched the island slowly moving away from them. Turning, she glanced at the sun. It was a molten disk. She closed her eyes, and its warmth felt good on her upturned face.